On today's show, let's get to know Donovan Mitchell with someone who knows him best. That's Andy Bailey from Bleacher Report. Let's get into it. I want to thank you, by the way, for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Remember, we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
All right, the music you heard on the way in is from our friends at Astro Radio. Check them out on Apple Music or Spotify. I'm Chris Manning, covering the Cavs and the NBA at large for places like Diamond UPROXX and SB Nation's Fear the Sword. Before we get into today's conversation with Andy Bailey, a few housekeeping notes. This episode comes out on Monday, September 26th. That is the same day that media availability starts. So we're going to be diving into that on the next two shows, perhaps the next three shows here on Locked On Cavs. A ton to cover from that, including Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, Okoro, Jared Allen. All these guys really talking about the Donovan Mitchell trade publicly for the first time. JB Bickerstaff talking again, Mitchell talking again, all of that. Obviously, there was also some Cavs news from over the weekend. Dean Wade signed a 3-year contract extension with the Cavs that will keep him with the team for a few more seasons now through the 25-26 season. First reported by Woj and then by Chris Frieder of Cleveland.com. This is a 3-year extension, $18.2 million. $2 million of that is in incentives. The rest of it is guaranteed. I like this move a lot. We're going to do a deeper dive breakdown on this on that media availability show once we hear from Dean Wade and things, but this is a good number, up below mid-level exception number for Dean Wade. He's solid, can shoot threes, plays a lot of three. I think if you're the Cavs, you feel good about this. I like being aggressive and trying to lock up some depth for this team as you're trying to build this out going forward. And I think most notably, Wade at 25 is a product of their development to some degree, right? Like this, he comes out of the 2019 draft as an undrafted player in large part due to injuries. He's on a 2-way deal with the Cavs, playing in the G League before he sticks with the Cavs. So they pick up the final year of his deal in June, sign him to this extension. He's now one of the only pieces they have locked up through 25-26. It is Garland. It is theoretically Mitchell based on his player option. It is Mobley, assuming he would agree to a rookie scale extension. It is Jared Allen and Dean Wade. That's it right now. And it's a reminder of how fast this can go, how much this can turn over in short order. But Dean Wade is good. I like this deal for the Cavs a lot. I like this for Dean Wade a lot. Maybe the Russell Wilson thing is a little bit of an interesting choice because that Russell Wilson stuff's kind of corny, but he's good. And I like this move for the Cavs a lot. Again, we'll be discussing that more on Wednesday's show, but wanted to give you the initial take on it here. All right, here's our conversation with Andy Bailey. All right, the music you heard on the way in is from our friends at Astro Radio. I'm Chris Manning. That's Evan Dammarell. We have Andy Bailey from Bleacher Report today, here to talk about Donovan Mitchell. Andy, thanks so much for coming on to help us understand Mitchell. It's been a little bit since the trade, but understand him, I think, from a detailed Utah perspective.
Yeah, thank you for having me, guys. I look forward to chatting with you about this.
So I want to just start big picture broadly. I say Donovan Mitchell. What is he? What is he good at? What makes him special? How do you answer that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. You've probably heard this for a while, or at least we've heard it in Utah because it was kind of the talking point early on. But he really is sort of a Dwayne Wade, Damian Lillard hybrid. And before you're like, whoa, that's a lofty comparison. More recently, I've tried to calibrate that a little bit more. He's maybe like 80% of Dwayne Wade and 80% of Damian Lillard. He's got the pull-up stuff that Lillard has. Incredibly high volume, three-point shooter. And the percentage is typically above average, or at least it has been recently. So that part of his game I have always found to be Lillard-esque. And then as a slasher and sort of the body type, he's more Dwayne Wade. Wade was a little bit taller, but Donovan Mitchell has really great wingspan. I'm guilty of this, but people often bring up the fact that he's 6'1". And I think there are some disadvantages to that, but I also think he's got like a 6'9" or 6'10" wingspan. So theoretically, he should be able to hold up against wings because that length is pretty important. Obviously, he doesn't have the defense that peak Dwayne Wade had. He doesn't have the playmaking that peak Damian Lillard had. But to me, there are elements of both of those guys kind of in one player. And for years, I thought if he ever becomes like the fully actualized version of that, and he's like a top 5 to 10 player in the league, which I always thought was kind of possible, that was Utah's key to winning a title. I always felt like they had a top 10 to 15 impact guy in Gobert. And you'll notice I use the word impact there because that's kind of a different thing than top 10 to 15 best player. But if they could have combined a top 10 guard with that, I felt like they were right on the cusp. But Mitchell has always kind of been in that like 20 to 25 range to me.
And so you mentioned a lot of things there. It's definitely an eyebrow raiser when you said at first Damian Lillard and Dwayne Wade. So thank you for saying 80% of each, because even then that's still a heck of a lot better than what the Cavs kind of had at the 2-guard spot to begin with here. But I'm going to focus in on the defense aspect because I think Donovan owning up to it in his introductory presser, saying he hasn't been good on defense up to this point in his NBA career. And he said, like, oh, I'm going to try harder this time around, and maybe JB Bickerstaff can pull it out of him. But Quinn Snyder was a pretty smart defensive coach when coaching Don. Do you think it's just a physical thing or an effort thing or what? Because Chris and I have kind of tried to find a way to like justify him being better on defense at times, because like you said, he does have a 6'10" wingspan that could make him capable of defending wing players.
Yeah, I think defense for most guys in the NBA is mostly about effort. And that's not just the NBA. I mean, that's basketball from the time you're a kid through the NBA. And he does have the physical tools. He's got that wingspan that we've mentioned a few times. When you watch him play offense, it's clear that he's got great, side to side athleticism. He's explosive. All that stuff should translate to the defensive end. And if you guys remember, the pre-draft process, he was billed as a defense first guy. And if you look at his college numbers, the offensive numbers aren't great. Like what got him drafted in the lottery was, for lack of a better comp, he was more seen as kind of like a Davion Mitchell kind of guy. He's going to come in and be like a ball hawk on defense. He's going to frustrate opposing guards. And I think he kind of did that for his first couple of years. His offense was always ahead of schedule. Like the fact that he averaged 20 points a game as a rookie was shocking. Nobody saw that coming. But his defense, I think, was okay those first couple seasons. And I can't pinpoint exactly when the switch turned off for him defensively. If I had to pick something right now, I'd say it was around the hiatus when COVID first popped off in 2020, and there was all the stuff between him and Gobert at that time. It just seemed like he sort of shut down mentally in certain aspects of the game. And that the clips are bad. And I think it's cool that he's owned up to it. But, man, over the last couple of years, there's so many moments where he just kind of stops on defense. On ball, off ball. The effort just wasn't there. And you mentioned Quinn Snyder. He's a good coach, and obviously he was able to get, top 5 to 10 defenses out of Utah a lot of those seasons that he was here. But I think a lot of time he was, you can't really punish Mitchell for not playing defense and take him off the floor for too long, because for large stretches of that time that he was with Cleveland, he's the engine of the offense. So it's a big give and take, and I don't blame Quinn Snyder for basically saying, give us what you can on defense because we need you on offense.
And on that defensive note, before we go into our first break, one of the things that stood out to me statistically was seeing that his last year, his steal rate was about where it was his first 2 years in the league. And then obviously he's kind of the most infamous is maybe the better word, defensive performance of last year is obviously the Dallas series where he gets put into the blender, chewed up, all that stuff. I'm not here to say that Donovan Mitchell is a good defender because I don't think that is where he's at. But are steals something he can do when he's engaged? Like, was there something last year with that where like, hey, like this is at least a way he's providing some value on that end of the floor, even if some of the other stuff isn't working? And is that something you think could work in his favor in Cleveland, where he's playing with Mobley and Allen? Maybe he can gamble a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that could be an indication of his value. Steals are tricky. I think they're a great indicator of defensive value when you look at like a college player and what he does in terms of steals and blocks. I think that tells you a lot about how he'll translate to the NBA. Steals in the NBA can indicate a lot of gambling, like you just mentioned, which can be a problem. I never really got the sense it was a problem with Mitchell. It was more just, like I said earlier, he would just kind of shut down on individual possessions. But yes, I do think in Cleveland, he probably can afford to be a little bit more aggressive. Obviously, he had Rudy Gobert backing him up for the last few years, and that affords a perimeter defender some luxuries that he wouldn't otherwise have. But particularly the last couple of years, it was only Rudy Gobert. They put so much on his shoulders defensively. It was kind of ridiculous, frankly. I mean, for large stretches, all four guys on the outside were turnstiles, and it was just like, Rudy's going to protect us. In Cleveland, you at least have, I mean, I think Evan Mobley's got a chance to be like a DPOY upside type of guy. So you got him on the back line, plus he can guard on the perimeter a little bit. I think Jared Allen is a good backline defender. I think there are guys with potential to be even better perimeter defenders than he had in Utah. So he's got a lot more help defensively in Cleveland, and maybe that allows him to kind of play free safety a little bit more and gamble a little bit more, and maybe that does up his value.
All right, we're going to go into a break, come back. We're going to talk about the offensive side of Mitchell, because that's what really makes him special. We'll get into how Quinn Snyder kind of juiced him up and more right after this. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline, your number one source for your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Find all of the latest league developments, game matchup news, and podcasts, including this year's slate of games every week, including Thursday Night Football, Saturday slate of college games, and every Sunday slate. BetOnline is also your continued source for your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and scores and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. That's BetOnline. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. For instance, Evan Mobley is a cool plus 1,600 to win Defensive Player of the Year at BetOnline. The Cavs over-under, meanwhile, is set at 46.5 after the Donovan Mitchell trade. That's BetOnline. That's where the game starts. Check them out today and get all of your latest betting needs from them. We thank them for supporting us. All right, back here in Locked On Cavs, Chris Manning, Evan Dammarell with Andy Bailey from Bleacher Report. Andy, I want to ask about the Quinn Snyder part of this, because I think one of the things that will very much differ for Mitchell in Cleveland than Utah is the setup. Snyder and JB Bickerstaff are very different coaches. The personnel is very different. It's not going to be as much of four shooter, or at least three shooters in Gobert and Mitchell, right? Like, it's going to look a little bit differently. So what did Snyder's offense do to unlock Mitchell, juice him up, and set him up to be what he has been the first several years of his career?
Well, first of all, I think I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think one of the keys for Donovan Mitchell really his whole career was that Snyder just kind of gave him the keys, right off the bat as a rookie, and trusted him to kind of do his own thing. And that was, there weren't a lot of lines for that box. The first couple of years, he really was just kind of free to do what he wanted. More recently, in the last couple of years, Utah has become one of the heaviest pick and roll teams in the league. And it wasn't just with Mitchell, it was tons of guys. I mean, every guard ran pick and roll, and Rudy Gobert is bouncing all over the floor, setting ball screens for everybody, all possession long. But specifically with Mitchell, his volume as a pick and roll guy was off the charts. I just looked this up last night. The only player who took more field goal attempts per game as a pick and roll ball handler last season was Trae Young, than Donovan Mitchell. So he's doing it a lot. And we mentioned his pull-up threes earlier when we compared him to Damian Lillard. He's actually really good as a pull-up mid-range shooter too. So he doesn't just have to, dribble off to the side of that ball screen and pull up for three. He can advance it a little bit into the paint, and he's got a really nice mid-range pull-up game. And like you said, he was often surrounded by shooting. Obviously, Gobert's not a shooter, but they did as much as they could to sort of stretch the floor out, even with Gobert in the lineup. So it was tons of pick and roll in the middle of the floor with shooters to spray out to. And sometimes he was pretty good at that. I think he's gotten a lot better recently at that part of his game. That was always something that still seemed to need development. He was great at getting his own shot out of the pick and roll. He could be a little better at creating for others, but that's not going to be as big of a deal in Cleveland. With Utah, I always thought his ultimate ceiling is going to be reached if they just accept the fact that he's a point guard and kind of make him do that part of the offense more, where he's setting up other guys. Cleveland has Darius Garland.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's ever going to be the playmaker that Darius Garland is. So he doesn't need to do that. And there are a lot of ways Garland is going to make his life easier. His catch and shoot numbers, they dipped a little bit in 21-22, but he was well over 40% in the 2 seasons before that. And he's going to get more catch and shoot opportunities. That's going to happen with Darius Garland as his teammate. So I think there are ways that even if he's a little bit more confined than he was in Utah, I actually think he could be better with Cleveland.
And just to jump off that a little bit, because the Darius Garland point was going to be in specifically the catch and shoot numbers. That's encouraging to hear, because we were talking about that the other day with Mitchell playing off ball a lot too. Do you think Donovan is going to be comfortable in an offensive scheme where there's going to be quite a few possessions that Darius Garland just takes the ball and they expect Donovan to play off ball and maybe be one of those shooters that he sprays out to, or just kind of acts as the secondary guy? Because it's going to be a bit of buddy ball at first until they figure it out. And going from the system in Utah where you were the de facto guy to coming to a system in Cleveland where there is a clearly established guy, like, do you think there's going to be some growing pains, and do you think Donovan will just kind of accept it?
I'm sure it'll take a little bit of time. I don't think the learning curve will be as dramatic as it is with, say, like Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. Although I think those guys are going to figure it out too with how unselfish they are. But I think because Darius Garland, you guys obviously have watched him more than I have, but he's really unselfish when I watch him play. And I think he'll be very keyed in on getting Donovan Mitchell what he wants, keeping him involved. And as long as Donovan Mitchell is finishing possessions, I think he'll be fine. Maybe he'll take 2 or 3 shots fewer per game than he did in Utah. I don't think it'll be like dramatically less than he did with the Jazz. So I think he'll be fine. It could take, like you said, maybe 2 weeks, a month to figure it out. But I think when you play with a point guard who's really unselfish, like Darius Garland, it kind of makes everybody happy.
Andy, is Mitchell, I guess in this context, if you're thinking about how you would kind of, let's just say I'd imagine there's a world where the Cavs stagger. They're going to stagger Mitchell and Garland. I think that just makes a lot of sense. I would also imagine they stagger Mobley and Allen. My instinct would be say, let's put Mitchell with Allen because it recreates some of the Gobert dive man, easy lob situation. I think, as you said, Garland, I think, is the better playmaker of the two. I think if you're banking on someone coaxing Evan Mobley's lob threat energy out of him, it's probably more likely to be Garland than Mitchell would be my guess. Is that to you like a reasonable instinct if you're going to kind of not silo them, because that's not how this works, but if you're going to kind of broadly pair these two together, would you say Mitchell with Allen kind of makes a lot of sense on paper as you're kind of building this out?
I think it does make sense for the reasons that you just laid out. If I was Cleveland, I would experiment with Mitchell and Mobley at the very least. One of the issues I think with Mitchell and Gobert over the last few years is he wasn't either willing or able to make that lob pass to Gobert that a lot of other guys are. Gobert had phenomenal chemistry with Joe Ingles because Joe Ingles is a good pick and roll playmaker, and he'd just throw it to Gobert. He was a great lob passer. Mitchell missed that a lot. And And if it's unwilling, then it's fine to pair him with Jared Allen. If it's unable, then you've got a little bit of a problem. The other reason I would experiment with Mobley is Mitchell's a great slasher. When he wants to get to the rim, he's phenomenal at it. There are very few guys that can stop him. And over the last few years, it was like in late game situations, a lot of times when he kind of feels like, okay, I got to go win this thing, he would get to the rim a lot, and he would do it. I mean, he's phenomenal at slashing. So if you pair him with a big that you can trust at least out to like 18, 19 feet, I do think Mobley's range is going to extend to the 3-point line, if not this year, at some point in his career. But if you play him with a big that allows you to keep all 4 guys outside the paint, it'll open up those driving lanes a little bit more for Mitchell. Whereas Jared Allen, I think it's pretty safe to say he's going to be more, central on the floor, and that crowds things a little bit. So I think there are pros and cons to him being paired with either one of those bigs. If I was Cleveland, I'd spend the preseason or maybe even the first couple of weeks of the season seeing, okay, which one of these works better. And the luxury I think that Cleveland has is you can probably make arguments to mix and match those guys in any way, and you would have pros in any situation. They have such an interesting roster to me, and I think there's a bunch of ways it could work.
I think they're missing one shooter. In a perfect world, I almost wonder if it would have been better for them to keep Markkanen over LeVert, because the Markkanen shooting would have just helped them a lot. But I almost wonder if whether it's Mobley or Allen, if Kevin Love is sort of the other part of this, just to space around Mitchell, because there's going to be there's just value in giving Mitchell room to do Donovan Mitchell things, and I think part of the reason that it worked in Utah was that they gave him space.
For sure, and I think that's something I thought about with Kevin Love. I think he had a wildly underrated season last year, probably not among you guys and Cleveland fans, but all season long, I'm like, why isn't anybody talking about this guy as 6th man of the year? His per possession averages were basically like Timberwolves Kevin Love plus a bunch more 3-point shooting. And I think trading, including Markkanen in this trade, while it has the drawback that you just mentioned, I think there are now more front court minutes available for Kevin Love. And maybe you don't want to tax him much more than you did last season. Maybe that's part of why he was so good, is because his minutes were kind of down. But if the rotation is just those 3 big guys, Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, and Kevin Love, everybody's talking about the backcourt, and understandably so, with Mitchell and Garland. But man, that front court is really interesting to me.
Yeah. All right. One more break. We'll come back. We're going to talk about expectations for year 1 of Donovan Mitchell in Cleveland.
Welcome back to Locked On Cavs. I am Evan Dammarell. He is Chris Manning. We are joined by Bleacher Report's Andy Bailey to talk all things Donovan Mitchell. And Andy, we talked about a little bit, like you said, figuring out in preseason, figuring out maybe the first 2 weeks to a month of the regular season. We've really preached out on the show because Chris asked me point blank, oh, do you think this is going to be working right away and the Cavs are just going to come out and steamroll opponents? And I don't. I think there's going to be growing pains no matter what, just because expectations have shifted for this young team. And just as a guy who has followed Donovan closely with Utah and someone who has kind of paid attention closely to the Cavs in general, what do you, just as a broad stroke question, what do you expect from this Cavs squad, at least for year 1 of Donovan Mitchell in tow?
I think if everybody's generally healthy, which is the caveat you have to include for every team, but specifically with Cleveland, they had so many injuries pile up at the end of last season. If guys are generally available, I have a hard time thinking this team doesn't get to 50 wins. They just check so many boxes to me, yeah. and really one of the only boxes they didn't check last year is the guy who can just kind of go get buckets, which is what Donovan Mitchell is. I do think Darius Garland was that too, but he's also the table setter, and I think he was keenly aware of that. And he wasn't the kind of guy who was going to go out and force 25 shots. And there will be times when it seems like Donovan Mitchell is forcing, and that's one of those things that the team is going to have to iron out. and I think he over time will realize I don't have to do that here because I've got Darius Garland to set me up. I've got these big guys who can support us in all these different ways. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it will take a little bit of time just because there are new pieces. Darius Garland and Evan Mobley are still pretty young. Like there's still growth and development for those guys too. But when everything sort of clicks together in, say, mid-December or something, I think they're going to be really good. And I think this is a 50-win team. The thing is, I used to only be able to say this about the West, but it's the Eastern Conference now too. Like 50 wins, does that even get you home court advantage now? Yeah. It's that part of it is tricky. I think they'll be a very good team, but there's just so much depth in the conference all of a sudden that I would hesitate to guess where they'll be on the standings. But all in all, I think they're well balanced, extremely talented, room to grow for some of their best players. They're in a phenomenal situation.
I think the 50 wins thing is about where I am at as well. I think at the very least, like their offense was like a slight injuries and all that into it, but slightly below average last year. There's just no way the offense isn't maybe not significantly, but like noticeably better with Mitchell. Like it's just going to function better because they have Mitchell. And to your point about him like forcing things, I went back and watched part of the playing game against Atlanta, and there was just moments in the game where you're screaming for someone to force it almost and to go get stuff. And it's like their options for that were Darius Garland, who his like clutch stats last year were pretty bad, and that teams were throwing so much attention at him at a certain point, and Karis LeVert. Those are not going to like win you in the muck half court tricky basketball games that they're going to be up against now, right? Like they need, I think to your point, Andy, like they kind of needed to, like whether it was Mitchell, whether like maybe in a different world there's a world where they try to run it back with Sexton, or maybe they trade for Murray or whatever. They needed to make some kind of move to go get this. And like offensively, Mitchell's just he's going to alleviate pressure that they just kind of, that like was, aside from the injuries, maybe to me the biggest reason why they kind of fall out of the playoffs last year, why they don't get out of the play-in, because they just kind of ran out of answers. Mitchell's going to provide a bunch of answers for things that they didn't have answers for a year ago.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I saw that a bunch of times in Utah. I should have looked up his clutch numbers over the last few years before we did this, but just from an eye test and feel point, which I think you guys know I hate to cite, but I'll do it now. There have been so many moments over the years where it's like gut check time, and he can get you a bucket. And I think the mid-range game that I mentioned earlier is a big part of that. That's a shot that defenses are typically more willing to concede, and he's good at it. He can also get all the way to the rim. I think his playoff numbers are probably a pretty good indication of what he is in those big moments. I looked this up last night. Last three postseasons, he averaged 32 points and 5 assists and shot over 40% from three. There is something in his head that sort of clicks on when the stakes are high. We went over the debacle that his defense was against Dallas, but I think on balance, he's been a phenomenal playoff performer. And I think what you're talking about, those moments where Cleveland just needs a guy to go get some points, he can absolutely do that.
And it's not just the playoffs or just the play-in tournament, just because, like you said, 50 wins may not even be enough to get home court in the first round if you're Cleveland, but you saw a lot of this last year, especially towards the tail end of the season. I think Darius Garland's one actually put it bluntly, where the Cavs just haven't been in this position up to this point before. And you keep mentioning it, and Chris has said it a few times as well in shows prior to this, that this depth of experience that Donovan has, like he has 39 playoff appearances, and he has been there before, and he's been the guy so many times for the Jazz. Like, I think more than anything, him being that guy who makes them comfortable when they're most uncomfortable is going to be really what drives them through the regular season and gets them to these new heights they're looking for. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but I feel like one of the biggest cerebral aspects of getting Donovan Mitchell is just he can push this team in ways that they haven't been pushed before.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the NBA season is long. We all know that. And if you're going to get to 50 wins, there are going to be some over the course of the season that you kind of have to power through. And there are certain guys that can get you those wins in the slog that other guys can't in the middle of the regular season. So they're going to steal a few that I think they wouldn't have otherwise stolen without Donovan Mitchell. He's clearly an upgrade over Karis LeVert. People talked about the price of both the Gobert and the Mitchell trade a lot, but I think it made sense in both instances. Cleveland already has two, high end prospects in Evan Mobley and Darius Garland. It's probably not even fair to call them prospects anymore. Certainly not Garland. How much more were you going to get out of those draft picks? I think this is a swing worth taking. I think Donovan Mitchell adds wins in the regular season. And like you said, he's got a ton of playoff experience. So I would expect to see them in the playoffs with him. They're going to be really fun to watch.
Andy, we'll end on this. When you think back of Donovan Mitchell in Utah, the run he had, what is do you have a defining moment that kind of explains him? Is it the playoff game against the Nuggets? Is there something about his Utah tenure that kind of will stick out to you in retrospect?
I would say that whole series against the Nuggets. I can't remember what he averaged in that series, but I'm going to look it up real quick.
I will do that as you talk. I will.
I've got it.
Okay.
It's 36.3 points. He had 51 in game 4, 57 in game 1, 44 in game 6. A lot of people have come back after the fact and talked about not just the numbers that Jamal Murray and Donovan Mitchell put up in that series, but also the Lakers championship. And that, everybody kind of throws an asterisk on it now because it was in the bubble and there was no fans. Which I think maybe there's a little bit of fairness to that. But at the same time, the guy had 3 games of at least 44 points in a single playoff series against a good team. That to me, that series showed his competitiveness in a way that I don't think anything else in his Jazz tenure did. And it kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier. There are moments when I think he senses the stakes are really high, and he, at least offensively, he usually rose to the occasion. Never more so than in that series. And if Cavs fans are looking for more reasons to be excited about this season, I'm sure there's YouTube highlight reels of what he did in that series. His entire offensive arsenal was on display. He's a 3-level scorer. I think he raises Cleveland's ceiling immensely. And that series, I think, more than anything, showcased this guy is ultra competitive, ultra talented offensively, checks a major box for Cleveland.
Yeah, after all the sickos get done watching Donovan Mitchell in a Browns jersey smashing a Pittsburgh Steelers guitar, I'm thinking they should watch the playoff stuff.
They're 1-0 at home whenever Donovan Mitchell smashes a guitar. So.
Look, I will say, if someone at his agency or in the Cavs gave him a playbook of how to get the Gets Us meter going up, it's put on the Brownie elf hat, go to a game, put on the jersey, and smash the Steelers guitar. I know he's a big Mets fan, but if he goes to a Guardian, and he's talked about being friends with Ahmed Rosario, the Guardian shortstop, if he goes to a playoff game and is wearing a Stephen Kwan jersey, just let's buy all the stock you can. The vibes will be absolutely immaculate.
I'm sure you'll see him there. Yeah.
Yeah, he's I looked through his Twitter last night looking to see if he tweeted the interview to Taylor Rooks or whatever, and it wasn't up. And I did see that he was just tweeting about Lindor home runs. I'm just okay, this guy's just I respect that he is just being, his Twitter is sort of real in a lot of ways that some other guys are just branding purposes. All right, that's going to be it for our episode with Andy Bailey today. Andy, thank you so much for coming on. Just people can find you Bleacher Report, but are you ready for the season? Are you ready for what's about to come our way, or what's going on your end?
I'm so excited. I was telling my wife this the other day. By this point in the off season, I am so sick of hypothetical analysis. I feel like I've written the same article for Bleacher Report 50 times this summer. So I'm very much ready to see all these teams in action. I think the NBA's hit a point of parity that's just makes it so fun to watch. Like I mentioned earlier, I think there's 5 or 6 teams in each conference that are going to be good to really good. And the competitiveness that's going to spawn all over the league. I think every night there's going to be 2 or 3 really good games on. I'm really excited for this season. I love how much talent there is in the league right now. I can't imagine, I've said this a few times. This is the most talent-rich era of the NBA. So I can't wait for it to start.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks again, Andy, for coming on.